One take. Hi, I'm Jesse Suter. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion at the University of Vermont. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm really excited to be doing a podcast with Michael Giangreco. Michael, you are my mentor, colleague, and friend, and also University of Vermont distinguished professor, Emeritus in special education. That's still hard to say because we worked together here for so long and you have retired. So thank you for doing this. As a quick visual description, so I'm a white man in my 50s with no hair, some facial hair turning gray, and I'm wearing a pink striped shirt. Michael, I think distinguished professor is almost a good enough description, but you are a white man, a little bit older, a little more hair. You're wearing brown glasses and a red sweater over a blue-white striped shirt. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So when I thought about sort of what we could talk about, because we've talked with each other for a long time, we met, I think, when I was a graduate student here at the center. And I always have to look at that wall over there because it's my internship diploma. And it reminds me that my internship was in 2003. And so that must mean I met you the year before that. Because that's when I left, and you were a big reason that I wanted to come back. So I went to graduate school here. We met during one of my placements here at the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion, and it was you and Ruth Hamilton and a few other people that just sort of introduced me to the heart and soul of this work, community inclusion. And so I wanted to come back immediately. So I did my internship. And I talked to Ruth and I said, can I come back, please? Is there anything I can do at the center? And then you and I started working together more formally not long after that.
Right. It was actually, I was asked to serve as your mentor through the mentoring program.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And then I realized very quickly how talented you were, and I wanted you working on projects with me.
Oh. So this is exactly why I was happy that you wanted to do this, because you always make me feel so good about myself whenever we talk. So it's all just an excuse for more of that.
We've had many good years of collaboration and friendship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was thinking about what we could talk about, I just thought about all of our conversations that we've had since we met, and not only did you support me as a mentor professionally in terms of the research, but again, that heart and soul aspects of the job is something that was really absent from all of my training in clinical psychology and through graduate school. It was much more about, we do the research to come up with the best interventions, and then the goal is to just get those interventions to as many people as we can. That was the whole model. That was the approach. And when I think about some of the first conversations we had, and I'd love you to talk about this a little bit, which is you got into this area, as I recall, not because research was the solution for everything. That's not how you improve the world.
Yeah, I didn't get to it through research.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk about kind of your journey a little bit. So if we could kind of start there, so how you got into working with people with disabilities, got into schools. Because I always love hearing this part.
I got into it by accident.
This is why I love it.
As a student in high school, I was at best a marginal, maybe B- student in high school. I think my high school teachers would be shocked to learn that I got a PhD.
Did you tell any of them?
No, I don't think I ever did tell any of my high school teachers that. But the summer between my junior and senior year in high school, I was visiting some friends outside of Pittsburgh, a little place called Murraysville, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And one day when I was there, they said, "Oh, come with us, we're volunteering at this day camp." And they never thought to mention to me that it was a camp for students, children with and youth with intellectual disability.
Right.
So when I arrived there, they had kind of planned things that they were scheduled to do, and they were like, oh, just like go here and like play with these kids. And I didn't know what to do, because, you know, as a kid growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, kids with disabilities were not around.
Right.
I mean, I have 3 strong memories from childhood of interacting with people that had pretty significant disabilities. One was a little girl who lived on our block, who I know used a wheelchair for mobility, and I'm pretty sure she was nonverbal, and a bus came and picked her up every day and took her to some place that
Right.
I don't know where it went, and her parents, you know, took her on walks, but none of us knew her. That was pretty common. I also remember that one of my mother's friends had a child at the time who was a teenager who had very severe cerebral palsy. I didn't know it was cerebral palsy at the time. And I remember being at their house, and I have this distinct image of his mother feeding him a tuna fish sandwich, you know. And I'd never encountered somebody with that level of disability before. And the third was, I remember in our elementary school, we had a classroom of kids who people made fun of. I remember that. And one of the reasons was because they weren't our age. They were all older. You know, they were kids old enough to have a 5 o'clock shadow. But again, they didn't eat in the cafeteria at the same time that we did. They were very segregated from us. We just didn't know them. And so disability had never really been on my radar. But that day at the summer camp, it felt very natural to me, like just interacting with people that, in this case, it was people with primarily intellectual disability. And I had fun, you know, I mean, I really enjoyed it. And I thought, I didn't know what I was going to college for. I didn't have a profession in mind. And I thought, you know what, I could do this. Maybe I'll go to school for special education. And so I did. And my first semester, or actually it was my second semester in college, I ran into an old high school friend who was working at a summer camp, a residential summer camp called Cradle Beach Camp outside of south of Buffalo in Angola, New York. And she encouraged me to apply. And that was one of the most important decisions I ever made in my life, because Cradle Beach has been around since 1888. It first served, its first was considered what was called a fresh air mission, which was to bring economically disadvantaged inner city children to the country to try to put some weight on them and give them some fresh air. And then after World War II, they started including children with disabilities, first separately at a separate time. But then within a few years following World War II, they started integrating children with disabilities and their non-disabled peers at the camp. And it was very unique, and it still is unique today in terms of a place where kids with and without disabilities go to camp together. And the one downside of it, so to speak, is the fact that it's a bit out of proportion in terms of there's proportionally more children with various disabilities than there are kids without disabilities. You know, it's about half and half, and that's kind of out of proportion to what you'd see in the real world. But one of the things that it did 2 things for me. One was it exposed me to an enormous range of different types of physical, intellectual, emotional, sensory disabilities. But the more important part, and I did this for 7 summers during college and then my early teaching career, was that I was living in community with people with disabilities. And we also had a lot of counselors and staff who had disabilities of various sorts. The guy who ran the arts and crafts program had severe cerebral palsy. We had counselors who were deaf, counselors who were blind, counselors that had different physical or orthopedic disabilities. So it was just an amazing kind of mix of people. And we were together 24/7 for our camp sessions were 2 weeks at a time. There were 200 kids at the camp at one time.
Really big, yeah.
Yeah, and like 100 staff, and we ate together, and we slept in cabins together, and we camped together, and our whole purpose was having fun.
Right.
Safely.
It was camp.
It was camp.
Yeah.
We were and anything that any other kid could do, any kid with a disability could do, and we just found, and none of us were trained, right? Really. Right. And there was a little bit of orientation, but it was really more of a mindset, like these are kids, and we're going to do fun kid things, and we're going to do them all together, and if there's some barrier in the way, we'll figure out a way to make it work. And it was grand. It was a grand time, and it was probably one of the most meaningful things in terms of, you mentioned kind of the heart and soul, because you never can know exactly what it's like to be the parent of a child that has a severe disability or some kind of really intensive need, but you get a tiny glimpse of it when you're living in a residential situation.
Right.
Because, for kids that needed it, we were dressing them, we were changing diapers, we were feeding kids, we were, carrying them from their wheelchairs into the pool. We were doing everything that a parent would do. We were up in the middle of the night if somebody woke up with a nightmare, and so you got a small glimpse of that. But the cool thing about the socialization of it was we weren't there to be their teacher. We weren't there to be their counselor. We were there to have fun together. And it just created I think in many ways it kind of inoculated me from some of the professional socialization that puts professionals here and people with disabilities here. There certainly is always a power imbalance when you've got a child and an adult, a camper and a counselor, but it's different than kind of professional socialization.
Right.
So that was super influential. And then one of the people that worked at the camp worked at, it was actually a married couple at the time. They worked in the only group home that was available. Remember, this is the mid 1970s. Deinstitutionalization is just getting started.
Right.
And group homes were like brand new. There was one in Western New York, Granger Place on the west side of Buffalo. I volunteered there and did some internship credits there, and then I ended up getting a job. And the last 2.5 years I was in college, I was working full time at a group home for adults with developmental disabilities, mostly those with intellectual, all of them had an intellectual disability. Some of them had other disabilities as well.
And about how big was the group home? Like how many people were living there?
There were 6 residents in the group home. And, today we have, kind of more natural options than congregating people in group homes. But at the time it was kind of an innovation.
Yeah.
And
as opposed to a big institution.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was, originally I was working the 11 to 7 shift.
Yep.
So, but I was showing up at dinner time. I was having dinner with the residents, hanging around in the evening and doing my homework. And then I was responsible to be there overnight and in the morning to get them making their breakfast and off to work or day programs that they were in. And, again, it was, the goal was helping people live their life, and none of us knew what we were doing. They hired a 19-year-old kid. That gives you an idea of how devalued, like a 19-year-old kid that is still in college, could get a job doing this.
I mean, those are the exact same options that were options for me in graduate school in mental health, because we had the same thing where we had overnight programs or residential treatment centers, and some of them were small and some of them were big. But yeah, that's who you hired to have the overnight shift. And,
yeah, and then later, actually during student teaching, I had the 3 to 11 shift, and the group home gave me some flexibility once residents were kind of getting ready to go to sleep to do my lesson planning and stuff like that. Yeah. And so, but I think that basically I was living with people with disabilities in community, for several years. And that's a really different experience than just showing up and seeing people at school or a clinic or something and then going.
Yeah.
So then I became a teacher, special ed teacher, and I was there at the beginning of the IDEA. Yeah. Whether it was, of course, then it was originally called the EHA, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. But as you know, and probably many of the listeners know, that law passed in 1975, but it wasn't to be enacted until 1977. They gave them schools 2 years to ramp up and states 2 years to ramp up. And my first year teaching was the 77-78 school year. I started in January, but it was the 77. It was the very first year of the federal law being in place. I was a preschool special ed teacher in a rural, very, very rural community.
I didn't remember it was preschool.
Yeah, preschool special ed. We had some kids that were there for a morning session, some for an afternoon, and some that stayed all day. And I worked with a team there. And then I had 2 other teaching experiences. These were all in New York State. Starting up in Plattsburgh the next year, the first classroom, and again, this was during an era of segregation, particularly of people with severe disabilities, the first public school classroom for kids with what was then called severe and profound disabilities. So I had kids with deaf blindness, kids with severe autism, kids with severe intellectual disability, you name it, they were in there with it, and they were from 5 to 21. And it was in the wing of a vocational center, but it was a special ed kind of segregated setting. But it was the very first public school program. And the personnel preparation programs at that time didn't prepare you to work with kids with more intensive needs. Yeah. So, I'm winging it, based on camp and and
well, it sounds very similar to camp where you guys were. It was just a community figuring it out.
I mean, and IEPs were brand new. So we one of the things that I learned quickly was right across the lake from me, here at the University of Vermont, there was a new federally funded personnel preparation program to prepare teachers to work with students who had severe and multiple disabilities. And so I got on the ferry at Cumberland Head and came across Lake Champlain twice a week and during the summer over a 1.5 year period to get my master's degree, focused on students with severe and multiple disabilities. And that was absolutely invaluable.
So was the master's program connected to the center? I know there was faculty that were.
Absolutely, yeah, it was connected to the center.
Yeah, so that's how you became connected to us first.
Yeah, that's how I became connected to the center. But so I taught, and then for a short time I went down to Virginia, worked at the University of Virginia Children's Rehabilitation Center as an outpatient orthopedic clinics. Did some graduate work down there, did an EDS degree in special ed down there with some wonderful people, but really talented folks. And then went back to teaching and taught in Ithaca. And then from there became a special ed administrator, where I really got into desegregating some programs in Auburn, New York, with a wonderful team of people there. And while I was doing that, I did my doctoral degree at Syracuse. And when I finished, folks here at the center said, we have an opening for a grant position. And we joke about it now, but I almost didn't get that job.
Yeah.
Even though there were only two applicants, I almost didn't get that job.
That's
but
come up a few times.
But I did get that job, and that led to a 34-year career here. But the thing is that the research that I ended up doing was all related to challenges that I either encountered personally in 13 years of working in the field, or things that I thought were, really holes in the literature.
Right. Well, and so that's another big transition that I want to talk about, was from teaching and administration to research. So that first grant that you came to, was that a research position, or were the future projects that you worked on research?
The first grant was a grant that had been originally co-written by Wayne Fox, who was the longtime director of the center, and Shaggy Cloninger, and it was a project to support students who were on the Vermont Deaf-Blind Register, what we now call dual sensory impairment, but at the time it was the Deaf-Blind Register, in inclusive classrooms around Vermont. And I became part of the Vermont I-Team, and I served statewide supporting schools who were working with kids who were on the register.
Right.
Now, for people who maybe are not in the deaf-blind or dual sensory field, people often think of like Helen Keller,
right,
as a classic example of somebody who's deaf-blind. That was not the population that we were serving. The vast majority of students, and there were only about, I think, 28 or 30 statewide who were considered deaf-blind or at risk of deaf-blindness. They met certain criteria. They were almost all students with quite intensive multiple disabilities. Very few had verbal language. Very few had the physical capability to use sign language because of severe orthopedic disability. And so it was very difficult to really fully know what their cognitive abilities were. So, we did what I think everybody at the Center on Disability believes in, which is we made decisions based on the least dangerous assumption.
Right.
So we approached everyone as if they were cognitively capable, because that was the least dangerous way to approach them.
Right.
And so that led to that was a grant-funded position, which was only going to last for 3 years. And the only way I could stay at the university was to start writing my own grants, which I did. And that first grant was a model demonstration grant. And then I wrote a series of research grants and model demonstration grants and training grants over the next 20 years to fund myself and others here. And that's where we started getting into some research and related services decision-making and paraprofessionals and service delivery. And yeah, that's what got the ball rolling.
Right. And I mean, so and you talk about sort of getting into research because you needed the funding in order to stay here, and that was true for everybody. But I don't think there were many researchers here. There certainly aren't today.
Right.
So there's lots of people that were writing grants, but they might be a personnel preparation grant or a training grant.
Even when we were doing model demonstration grants, I think that having gone through 3 graduate programs at Vermont, then Virginia, then Syracuse, I was exposed to a number of scholars who kind of socialized me to think that if I was doing something that was useful or potentially valuable,
right,
that I needed to disseminate it, and that the best way to disseminate it was through writing. I was doing presentations as well, but through writing and through published research. I felt like I was in schools. I had opportunities to do a lot of observing and collecting data, and I was trained as a single subject researcher. And I did single subject research in my early career, but not here. Once I got into the schools, the nature of my research changed based on what schools would allow, you know? So a lot of the research that I did was descriptive research, both qualitative and quantitative descriptive research. And some of it was, a little bit of it was quasi-experimental, and some of it was evaluation research. But we pretty much, throughout all of my projects, we always took data and we always shared it. And sometimes we ended up sharing things that we didn't intend. Like the whole strand of the work that was done at the center, partially that I led on paraprofessionals and inclusive schools, we didn't start that with a grant on paraprofessionals. That started with a grant on related services for kids with deaf blindness. And we ended up with a ton of data related to paraprofessionals that was not part of our grant plan. But I remember talking to the team and saying, I think we've got some pretty interesting stuff here, and you know, I think we should really analyze these data. And it ended up with the publication of an article called something like Helping or Hovering, Effects of Instructional Assistant Proximity on Students with Disabilities.
That sounds like the exact title.
It might be.
Okay.
It might be.
It's something like that.
It's pretty close to that.
Yeah.
It definitely starts with Helping or Hovering. But it was published in 1997 in Exceptional Children. And that article turned out to be really a turning point or a demarcation point in the literature related to paraprofessionals. And you know, has become kind of a seminal article, along with another one that came out of an early grant called I've Counted John, Transformational Experiences of Students with Disabilities in Regular Classes. Those both came out of early grants and early data collection.
Yeah, well, I mean, so when I mentioned at the beginning, you know, some of the things that I gained from our mentorship, and that idea of research as communication and sort of really like giving back in a sense, because, you know, as you described in your own journey, and I don't think it's really changed much, you know, schools and different communities are left on their own to figure things out, and they might come up with amazing solutions that are exactly what they needed, or they might really spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. And so this idea that, no, when you do something, you should share it. Again, my own, you know, whether it's more traditional or just different experience in research was always, no, you do research because it's almost like that's the widgets we create as researchers. Or it's part of career advancement. It's a pressure that you need to do. And then sort of just a demonstration of your accomplishments in and of themselves, as opposed to, no, it's a communication tool. It's just a way of sharing.
It's one of the reasons why in many of the articles that I wrote over the year, I tried to have some kind of catchy little subtitle or beginning, like Helping or Hovering. People remember that. Or I've Counted John, they remember that, as opposed to some long academic title, you know.
Precarious or purposeful.
Simple, not easy. You know, just little phrases that, because, you know, I was always really conscious of, I'm doing this because I'm trying to influence certain people to improve opportunities and supports for people with disabilities. So who's my audience? My audience, teachers, principals, special ed directors, to some extent parents. So, you know, it was one of the reasons. It's interesting. I came out of Syracuse, and for people that know higher education at that time, and this would have been in the mid 80s to the late 80s, Syracuse was a hotbed of qualitative research. Some of the people who were writing the most like widely used qualitative textbooks at the time Stephen Taylor, Robert Bogdan, Sari Bicklin were at Syracuse. And most of my classmates there were on a qualitative track. And I was not. I was on a quantitative track, which was different. But all of us who went to Syracuse were all exposed, at least at an introductory level, to qualitative research. And interestingly, so I always saw the value in it. And I started really doing it, more fully once I left Syracuse. And my two most cited articles ever are qualitative, and a couple of others that were qualitative are also among the kind of most used. And when I look at it, and when I know about the feedback I've received from people, it's because people relate to it. They can see themselves, and they can see their own circumstance in the data. In fact, I saved very little from my office when I moved out. But one of the things I found tucked away in a couple of journals were some letters that I had saved that I got after the I've Counted John article was published. And I remember one of them said, a colleague was sharing some responses from some of his students, and one of them was like, I think you were eavesdropping in my teacher's room, because I've heard people say the exact same quotes that are in your paper, And the other one that I got from Bob Algazine, who is just an amazing special education scholar and has been for decades, down at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, somebody who I respect so much. And so it was super meaningful for me to get a letter from him. He was the editor of Exceptional Children at the time. And he was talking about his own feeling that, basically that inclusion was the way to go. And I hope I can get this right, because he made an analogy about swans, and basically that citing 1,000 white swans does not prove that all swans are white, but the sighting of just one black swan proves that all swans aren't white. And he basically was saying, like, your article, I've Counted John, and I should say credit to Ruth Dennis and Chaggy Cloninger and Susan Edelman and Richard Chapman, who were co-authors on that article, that our article was like a black swan, and it was going to disrupt things. When people said, well, kids with severe, because it was about kids with severe disabilities, people were saying, well, you can't include kids like that, you can include these kids, but not those kids, right? And he basically said it's going to make it much tougher on people to claim that these kids can't be included when they, read the transformations of the teachers in this article.
Right.
And so qualitative research, I've always liked mixed methods research, but qualitative research, I think, when done well, can be super powerful in telling the story and communicating to people in a way that sometimes when, the statistics are really complicated, it's like, you and I've had this conversation many times, because you're much more skilled at statistics than I am, and I'll be like, Jesse, you got to explain this to me. I can't write about this stuff, and we got to translate this into language. We can put the statistics in, but we got to put this in language that a teacher can understand and relate to.
Well, yeah, part of it is explaining it. Part of it is the marriage of both the quantitative and the qualitative, because again, my own background in this, I feel like, again, is also sort of values that I got from you that were just so helpful to me, is that having exactly the right statistical test for the specific situation that you're in is not necessarily the answer that is needed for any of the goals that you might have for research. And again, often the sort of the advice that I was getting was just sort of research publication for its own sake is a value, as opposed to, a teacher might want to read this and might see themselves in it and then need to understand what did you learn? What came from this? What should I do?
One of your other mentors, who we both love, John Burchard.
Mm-hmm.
I remember so clearly early in my career here at the University of Vermont, and of course for those who are listening and don't know John, he was a psychology professor on the faculty here for many years, along with his wife Sarah, and they did a lot of work around people with both developmental disabilities and people with kind of serious emotional, behavioral issues and mental health issues. And he always told me that the simplest statistic is the most powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, literally as simple as numbers and percentages.
Right.
And I think that that's true.
Yeah. To go from, sort of like the most traditional roots of sort of behaviorist principles, which people say are kind of stripping away all humanity, of, whether it's in teaching, or in clinical psych, which is my background. Both of you took that to like, what are the tools from those sort of quantitative, and whether it's a single case or multiple folks, for communication. What is and I can picture the graphs that I created with you and the graphs that I created with John, and it was really just to communicate. There are things that are happening that you need to pay attention to, but it's not the whole story.
Right.
The real story is, what does this person want out of their life?
There was a guy who was a part of the faculty that was working during the first summer program. His name is Michael Friedel. And he told me that he had some of the same kind of concerns. And he said that one of the ways that he was able to understand it better for himself was to think of these behavioral approaches as humanistic empiricism, where you were pursuing humanistic aims, but using empirically sound approaches. Because, like as a teacher of kids that had more intensive needs, for example, I had a student who had really, really severe head banging behaviors. I mean, he would put his head through, drywall. He had a kind of a permanent callus on his forehead from hitting his head. He was in danger of concussion and retinal detachment all the time.
Sure.
And trying to help him reduce that through positive behavioral approaches, as opposed to punishments or negative kind of things, was really important, really important in his life. And so I kind of reluctantly learned these behavioral approaches, and then I went back into my classroom in the fall, and I thought, well, I've spent all this time learning this stuff. I should try it out. So I wrote systematic instructional programs for my students' IEP goals, and those kids learned more in the first 2 months than they had the whole previous year. And it was because we were using sound instructional procedures and doing database approaches, database decision making, and so on. And then I was hooked. But when I used it, and always when I taught the behavior analysis course, I think that the behavior analysis course that was taught here at UVM was different than a lot of what is taught in applied behavior analysis around the country. Because the idea that behavior analysis has a heart is not anything that we invented here. I mean, it goes all the way back to Montrose Wolfe, who was one of the key people, along with folks like Donald Baer at the University of Kansas and a whole bunch of others at the University of Kansas back in the 1960s and 70s. And he wrote an article about applied behavior analysis finding its heart in terms of talking about social validity. And that's a classic in the field of applied behavior analysis. And the way we taught applied behavior analysis here was two ways. One was there are certain negative, punishment, response cost, overcorrection. There are a whole bunch of procedures that we made students aware of, but we didn't teach or we didn't encourage them to use, because we thought that using those approaches would interfere with them developing constructive relationships with their students.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think that a positive, constructive relationship is the basis for a safe learning environment and a healthy learning environment, you don't want to do things with kids that are going to interfere with you developing that positive stuff. So we just said, yeah, these things exist. They were used in the olden days. Some people still use them today, but we really don't encourage you to use these things. Yeah. We're going to stick on all the positive stuff. And we're going to talk about how we can apply these things in the most natural way. So people think, oh, ABA is only for behavior problems, only for kids with autism. It's only, this kind of mass trial, discrete trial training. It's like, no, it can be done in a very natural way, incorporated into the regular class. And in fact, I would argue that whether they label it as such or identify it as such, every parent on the planet and every teacher on the planet has used behavioral approaches. They may or may not use them systematically, they may or may not use them correctly, they may or may not label them, but they've all used modeling and cueing and fading supports and providing different types of prompts and feedback in terms of positive reinforcement or correction procedures. I mean, it's just ubiquitous. It's not like behavioral approaches were invented. They're just really a description of how humans teach each other. And then in applied behavior analysis, often you're exaggerating those, or you're doing them very systematically to try to get a specific behavior change. But they can be used extremely naturally, and often are by parents and teachers without even realizing what they're doing or naming it. So I worry sometimes that with people being attracted to ABA or repelled by it, that the people that are repelled by it are focusing on the misuses of the tools. The fact that it has been used in ways that harm people, physically or emotionally. It has been used to control people inappropriately.
And still is.
It still is, but it doesn't have to be. There's nothing about the tools themselves that do that. You can also use ABA procedures to improve someone's communication skills that encourage them to be able to self-advocate, to open up opportunities for them in work and recreation and communication and all kinds of really positive things, So, and so I think that it's too bad that it's so polarizing, because I think if it's looked at in a particular way, it's hard to deny that these are legitimate strategies, but it's how people use them and to what end they use them that is so, and that's where the heart part comes in. So, when people think of special ed or related fields as only about, using research-based approaches, everything we do is rooted in a set of values. And if it's not rooted in a set of constructive values that really support and raise people with disabilities or others, then it's either not very useful or it could be harmful. So you always got to check the relationship between, I think, the values and the practices.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, because that's another thing that you taught me. So I remember when we first started working together on our research, and I knew about inclusion and trying to help students with disabilities and help schools keep the students with disabilities in the regular education classrooms. And the more we looked into that as part of the Numbers That Count and Evolve Plus, and the more we were sort of pulling from the national data and thinking about research grants, and especially, we looked at the Institute of Education Sciences grant. It was all about academics. Like that really has to be the end goal of everything. Arguably, it should be for education. And I remember the conversation. I was saying, well, okay, so we're focused on inclusion, and they're focused on academics. So that's what we need to study. We need to demonstrate that students with, higher levels of inclusion, or, we can look at that, lead to better academics. And I love, you sort of stopped everything and said, there's civil rights issues, there's things that conflict with our values, and then there's research questions. And so as we're talking about behaviorism and we're talking about research, this is one of the things I've taken, is that these are tools in service of bigger humanistic values.
I'm sure part of the conversation we had was that inclusion is not a research question.
That was exactly what you said.
Whether
Yes.
or not kids get included is not a research question. An appropriate research question is around, in what ways can we more successfully include more kids with more diverse needs, but not whether or not, because they are human beings who deserve and have the right to the same civil rights and opportunities as any other person. So people that say, well, we've done this study and inclusion doesn't produce this outcome, therefore kids should be segregated.
Right.
To me, that's a misguided thing. And if you look at the law, if you look at the federal law, it's rooted in values.
Yes.
It tries to implement those values by asking people to use research-based approaches, but it's rooted in values. We're still not following nationally all the values that are embedded or enshrined in the law. And this is evidenced by the dramatic differences across the country in who's segregated and who's included. And even kids that are, quote, included, we got a lot of work to do. I mean, it's not pretty. There's no utopias out there.
Well, I mean, and some of they're not utopias, but I think some of the examples that you've shown me over time as we've been working in schools, and you would always say inclusion oriented.
Right.
It was aspiration. And it always came down to, it was a community of people trying to figure it out. And I think, and you can talk more about this, but I mean, a lot of the more recent work that you did was just, how do schools do that given the environments that they're in?
Right.
So the resources that they have and the pressures that they're under, and
they're under a lot of pressures. I mean, I think that what schools are being asked to do and what teachers and administrators do, frankly, I think it's harder today than it was when I was a teacher and an administrator. Because frankly, when I was a teacher, a special ed teacher, it was like the Wild West.
Sure.
As long as nobody was getting seriously damaged, just do whatever you're doing with those kids, nobody's complaining, we're happy, that was the expectations were so low, and of course, part of that changed nationally with the reauthorization, I think it was the 97 reauthorization of IDEA, where they put in the requirement for access to the general ed curriculum, because so many kids with disabilities were not getting access. They're still not, in many cases. So yeah, it's changed so much over the years.
I don't think I've ever heard you say exactly that phrase, but I'm not surprised.
Which phrase?
Well, just that it's harder today to work in school.
That's just my speculation, as because even though I haven't been a classroom teacher or a direct, service provider or administrator in a very long time, all of our research was in schools, and interacting with teachers and administrators and families, and just seeing what's happening. And this leads to, you mentioned earlier the phrase precarious or purposeful. It's one of the things that sent me on, along with you, on a path to look at service delivery issues, because what I kept thinking to myself was, I wonder if I could have been a successful special ed teacher under these conditions, because I would like to think that I was a successful special ed teacher in terms of my kids learning some things and working with parents and so on. But you always think, I wish I knew then what I know now, and all the missed opportunities to teach kids certain things or to do certain things, and those kind of haunt you. But when I would see, a teacher with, a caseload of, 18 kids and supervising 5 paraprofessionals and working across 5 grade levels, with, a dozen different teachers, and I think that's impossible. How can they do this work? And we have a huge turnover burnout problem in special ed.
And there's your answer.
Yeah,
A lot of them can't.
Yeah, a lot of them can't. And so, because you were part of this work, part of our work on service delivery was rooted in the idea that you can have the best staff, you can have people that are really skilled and have great values and working really hard, and they might have good instructional approaches and even in sound curricula, but if they don't have a service delivery model in which to work that is conducive to them using those skills and implementing those values, realizing those values, it kind of is all for naught. But all of the federal funding is about curriculum and instruction and behavior support, and almost nothing on service delivery. And to me, that's kind of the third leg of the stool that people aren't paying attention to. The precarious or purposeful, as you know, is based on we've got a cartoon that's in that article that's in the journal Inclusion that shows a house, and it's precariously on the edge of a cliff, overhanging cliff, and there's a big rope around it. It's being held back from falling over the cliff by an army of paraprofessionals. And it asks, on the brink, are you on the brink? And problems with service delivery models, because every year it seems like the pressures that schools are under financially and otherwise, they try to get as close to the edge as they can financially and resource-wise, and then any little thing pushes it over the edge. And it's like, this is not where you want to live. You got to live back here. How do we create models that where we live back here and we move within a reasonable range? And that means reducing caseload sizes, reducing the number of grade levels that special educators are working in, reducing the number of different teachers. So, as you know, we took existing data from 69 Vermont schools and looked at how that could be reimagined, reconfigured, so that it was real.
No new money.
No new money. And turns out, you can have models of service delivery if you're proactive, where you've got one special educator for every 3 or 4 teachers, hopefully all at the same grade level or at least contiguous grade levels. Now you've reduced the amount of curricular content that the special educator needs to be thinking about and responsible to support with the teachers, and reducing the number of teachers, which changes the communication, and embedding them in those environments. And that you can do that by reallocating resources. Vermont, of course, has historically been extremely heavy on the use of paraprofessionals. And if you trade some of those positions in, you're going to have fewer people, but you're going to have more highly skilled people. And that's nothing against the paraprofessionals. I mean, they're a very important part of the school community. They work really hard, but it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to students to treat them as if they are teachers. They don't get compensated to function as teachers. They're not trained most of the time. I mean, there are occasionally certified teachers working as paraprofessionals, but you can't count on that. And what people fail to realize is that it's an equity issue for kids with disabilities. If you don't have a disability, you get all of your instruction from a highly qualified, certified, licensed teacher. If you have a mild disability, if you have a specific learning disability, speech language impairment, high functioning autism, you are pretty likely to get the vast majority of your instruction from a highly qualified teacher and or special educator in combination. If you have a lower incidence disability, if you have an intellectual disability, if you have severe physical and either sensory or intellectual disability in combination, any kind of developmental disability, you are very likely to get a very high percentage of your education from a paraprofessional who not only is not as skilled or trained as the teachers, but is substantively unsupervised. And that's based on the data, and multiple studies demonstrate that.
Yeah.
And what people don't seem to recognize is that is a fundamental equity problem for people with disabilities. Not, because the mentality that undergirds that is, do they really need a highly qualified person? Isn't it okay if they just have like a nice mom or dad who, is willing to work for close to minimum wage? And,
right.
Well,
because I think for most, that's not even how it's understood. The way that they're thinking about it is, well, we all have access to the teacher in the school, and you're also getting the support. But that's what the data showed is that's not what's happening.
It's not what the data shows for kids with developmental disabilities.
Yeah.
I mean, we have some students who are getting 80+% of their instruction from paraprofessionals, and they're not seeing teachers hardly at all. They're getting their first instruction, not just supplemental instruction. They're getting their first instruction from paraprofessionals. Right. And again, this is not a knock on the paraprofessionals at all. They're being put in a very difficult situation.
Yeah. And
parents are being told, we're doing you a favor by, and that's one of the other things that's really interesting over time, and it's just emerging, but it used to be parents always fighting for, I want my kid to have a one-to-one paraprofessional, right? I think some of the most knowledgeable and advocacy-oriented parents have realized that that's not the panacea to have an adult attached at the hip, an untrained adult attached at the hip, or a lesser trained person attached at the hip. They want their kid to have access to a highly qualified teacher and special educator and other service providers.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so much of this work, points to just how difficult parents and families have with what they end up needing to advocate for. I mean, if you're talking about programs that still do punitive and behavioral discipline and electric shock, those programs are held in place by parents who feel like they have no other option. So it's not that they're thinking that this is what they want, but if they're not presented with a service delivery model that is healthy, and sort of promotes those constructive relationships that you say are sort of the cornerstone of academic achievement and social behavioral success, then they're going to go with what somebody's saying is a solution if the school's not offering one.
And a lot of times in the regular schools, because the parents, and this is what parents have told me, many parents have told me, they're worried that their child will fall through the cracks or that they won't get what they need from the regular ed system because the service delivery model is not in place.
Yeah, see it happening.
And so they want the kind of security blanket of that one-to-one paraprofessional as kind of, this is somebody who's going to be watching out for my kid all the time. So it's very understandable. Yeah. But to me, it's a symptom of a systemic problem, a set of systemic problems that we need to address. And that's why, the work that you and I have done in the last, particularly say 10 years, has really been focused on trying to encourage people to look at inclusive systems of service delivery that are less reliant on paraprofessionals, and that really are there to support teachers and students with disabilities, because special educators and others aren't there all the time.
I've got so many other questions, and you gave such a good description of one of your cartoons. So that feels like too good a segue to let go. So why cartoons? How did you get into that? We've been talking a lot about communication. That's obviously a very different communication strategy.
a lot of people love cartoons, right?
Mhm.
And some of the most popular cartoonists at that time were people like Gary Larson, Far Side cartoons.
Yep.
And so I would always look through
We're
his,
really dating ourselves right now, so
Yeah.
other people are going to have to Google
who
this.
Gary Larson is.
Yeah.
He was a famous cartoonist.
One of the best.
Had a whole Far Side series, but I would go through his books and calendars, and I'd try to find things that were related, and they were funny,
Mm-hmm.
very creative, and excellent, and they were kind of tangentially related, but they were not like spot on.
Right.
And interestingly, there were education cartoons back then,
Mm-hmm.
but many of the education cartoons made fun of students and they made fun of parents, or they made fun of teachers. But mostly they made fun of kids and parents. And I didn't want to do that. I kind of did want to make fun of us.
Sure.
Because I think of all of the ridiculous things that I've done in my own career and that I've seen well-intended colleagues do in their careers.
Right.
And so my cartoon series is subtitled, it's Absurdities and Realities of Special Education. And I did want to poke fun at the things that we as professionals do, kind of hold a mirror up to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So at one point I started to have these ideas and I started to write down, I started to draw out cartoons and the text and the images. But as you know, I can't draw to save my life. So my cartoons did not look very good.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, I was already friends with an amazing artist, Kevin Ruel, who does all different kinds of art.
Mm-hmm.
He agreed to work with me and he redrew my cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned about communication before. Most people don't read journal articles. I mean, a lot of professionals, if they're not in graduate school, if they're not in a master's program or some other graduate program, they're not like,
of course,
reading tons of literature, where you're publishing your stuff. But cartoons, like, people will look at those and they'll also remember them.
Right.
They remember the image, even if they and the meaning, even if they don't remember an article that they read.
Right.
So it was another way. I always tried to have 3 or 4 or more different ways to communicate the same thing. So we'd have a research study,
Mm-hmm.
then we'd have what we back in the day called the quick guides to inclusion, which was a very non-researchy, teacher-friendly way of having, like, here's the 10 most important things we want you to know about this topic. Right. And then for each one of the 10 things, there was 1 page of text. Mm-hmm. And it was purposely not researchy. It was purposely like talking teacher to teacher. Right. So research, quick guides, cartoons on the same topic. So all the cartoons are either based on research findings mm-hmm. or topical issues in the field of education, special education. Right. And so it was a way to communicate. And it was a lot of fun too. I mean, it was really fun working with Kevin, and it was fun going from my office to colleagues' offices and saying, look at this one that I just come on, what do you think of this one? And they'd be like, not so good, or oh, that's good.
Right.
They vetted me.
It must have been so much fun.
It was a lot of fun. And once they were done, nobody wanted to publish them. Publishers were afraid of them or didn't know what to do with them. Mm-hmm. They were worried that they would think that their publication house was unscholarly, or that I was unscholarly.
Right.
And so they were worried from like an image perspective. Will people, be offended by these cartoons? And I kind of hoped that some people would be offended, and some people were. Mm-hmm. Some of them are a little biting. Yeah. Some of them are funny. Some of them are they're all satirical. Mm-hmm. Some of them are just absolutely 100% truth.
Right.
With no creativity on my part at all. In fact, the one cartoon that's probably the most well-known, and it is certainly the most reprinted, is the one where it shows an image of a bunch of kids showing up at school on a snowy day, and the school custodian is outside shoveling the stairs, and a student who uses a wheelchair for mobility is waiting to have the ramp shoveled, and while the custodian is shoveling the stairs, the student asks him if he would shovel the ramp, and he says back to the student, well, basically when I'm done doing the stairs, then I'll do the ramp for you.
Right.
And the student says back to the custodian, but if you shovel the ramp first, we can all get in. Yeah. And it's like clearing a path for everyone, right? That's the moral of it. And that was not my brainchild. I can take pretty much, the only credit I can take is putting it into the form of a cartoon.
Right.
Because that story was actually, came from a student with disabilities in Vermont, and was part of a report that our dear colleague Deborah Lisi Baker had included in a report that was produced here at the center. And I saw that story, and I asked her, could she get me in contact with the student, because I'd like to make a cartoon about this. She got in touch with the student. The student said, yes, you can make a cartoon about it, but didn't want to be named. So I still don't know to this day who the student was.
Oh, wow.
But I know that there is a student out there who's certainly an adult at this point in time, who is responsible for that story. And it says on the side of the cartoon, inspired by a student with disabilities. Right. But so a few of them are absolutely not made up at all. They're just depictions of reality.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's literally right over your shoulder.
Oh, I didn't know it was behind me.
I was going to help you with any of the wording if you needed it. I don't think there's any debate that it's probably one of the most recognizable things that our center's ever produced. I mean, I see it everywhere. Certainly around campus and people's offices that I wouldn't necessarily expect. I see it pop up on Twitter from a group that I've never heard of, that have found it. So it's again, kind of going to get back to communication and just sharing stories as ways of educating and influencing people. It's powerful.
Sharing cartoons is really, you can find dozens of them. There's over 340 plus of the cartoons that Kevin and I have developed over the years, and you can find them in all different places. Because you were in my office many times. When I had an office here, I used to have a shelf that included books where the cartoons had been reprinted.
That's right.
And it's interesting to me. It was always interesting to me because I had a real hard time finding a publisher originally for the cartoons. Even academic presses that I'd published books with, didn't want to publish the cartoons. And it took literally a mom and pop publisher, very tiny publisher, Patrol Publications, in Minnesota, to take a chance on publishing them. They ended up publishing 4 books of cartoons and a CD, an interactive CD, which now nobody uses CDs anymore.
What's a CD?
And then they sold the distribution rights to Corwin, a Sage company, and then eventually they went out of print. The first one was published in 1998. Which is a long time ago now, but they're out of print, but they're still out there and available. But they've shown up in the really unusual places. You expect to see them in a special ed book, but they've shown up in books on universal design for learning. The UDL community has really picked up on that particular cartoon, but they've shown up in books about human diversity, intellectual disability, law books, the American Physical Therapy Association included 5 or 6 of them in one of their books on school-based therapy. They just showed up in all kinds of places. So, and they're still showing up. All these years later. Yeah, I think I'd like to wrap it up by saying, we still have a lot of work to do.
Agreed.
To support individuals with disabilities and their families. And one of the things I always encouraged my students and anybody that I work with professionally is to have a sense of urgency about this work, because while we're kind of researching and debating about like what's the best thing to do, kids are growing up.
Yeah.
Families are dealing with stuff, and they don't have the luxury of all of this. And so we need to, do as much as we can to approach the challenges as quickly and effectively as we can. And I think that one of the other kind of general things that I always shared with my students are regarding any practice, whether it's a paraprofessional providing lots of instruction or some therapy approach or whatever, is to ask yourself, would that practice be okay if the student didn't have a disability? And if it's not, you probably shouldn't be doing it, but it's a good question to be asking. I think also we need to be really continuing to be reflective and kind of hold a mirror up to ourselves, because a lot of things that get labeled as inclusive are not very inclusive.
Right.
Just physically having a student with a disability in a regular class is not inclusive, I don't think. And we're not going to have time to go into all the definitions of inclusion or characteristics, but the point is that
it's about belonging.
Yeah, it's about belonging, but there's a group of people that have created kind of a paper tiger where they want you to make a dichotomous choice. And they'll say, look, we can include kids, but they're not going to get good instruction.
Right.
Or we can give them really great instruction, but the price of that is we're going to have to segregate them to do all of our systematic instruction. And I think that is a false dichotomy. I think it's not only is it an unnecessary choice, it's a bad choice. Because the only way people with disabilities are truly going to have the same opportunities and truly be included is if we say, you know what, you have to have both.
Right.
Having good instruction in a segregated environment is not acceptable. And being physically present and not getting good instruction is also not acceptable. We have to have a really higher standard in saying, people with disabilities have a civil right to be included. Now our job is to figure out how are we going to provide them with high quality curriculum and instruction that they deserve and the supports that they need in order to access that learning. That's where we should be focusing on, not this, should we do it, should we not, you can have one or you can have the other. And I think that I want to just challenge people to think about that, and also to know that for those of us that have seen this come from, my earliest volunteer experiences were in institutions, and then I kind of lived through the deinstitutionalization movement, worked in that, segregated schools toward inclusive schools. Once you have experienced an effective collaborative team as a teacher or a service provider or a family, once you've experienced that true collaborative teamwork, and you've seen the possibility of what actually can happen for students with disabilities when they are truly included and appropriately supported, there's just no turning back.
Right.
Like you can't, every once in a while I get asked if I'll do something for like a segregated school, and it's like, I know you're working hard, I know you're trying to do good stuff, I know you have good intentions, but I can't bring myself to do anything that's going to strengthen you creating a better segregated environment,
Right.
But once you've tasted it and experienced it, there's just no turning back. So I really hope that the next generation, the current generation and next generations of teachers and special educators and related services providers, do better, get farther than than we've gotten, because we've kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of made progress and seen some backsliding. And it takes diligence, and it takes urgency. And as my very favorite coach, Marv Levy, former Hall of Fame Buffalo Bills coach, used to say about winning, I say the same thing about inclusive education, which is that it's simple, but it's not easy, not always easy. And I think that that's true about inclusion. This is not rocket science. Families do this all the time. Families are the best models that we have in real life for how do you include, really include someone who has a significant disability. So it's not rocket science. It's not that hard, but it's not always easy. So I think that'll end there.
I think that's a great way to end it. Michael, thank you for doing this, and thank you for just all your support and mentorship over the years. I've loved it. I've grown so much from it, and I still am. I'm still learning.
Me too. You've been great to work with.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.